So in today's video, we're going to do a step-by-step guide on how to build your first PC. So whether you're already getting started building your first PC or you're looking to build a PC in the near future, hopefully this video will help you guys out a lot in that endeavor. So first, with any PC build, you're going to want to start with your motherboard. So here we have our i7-8700K. We're going to install it in our Z390 gaming motherboard from Asus. So what you're going to want to do is find the gold corner on the CPU, and you're going to want to match that up on your motherboard. And in most cases, the writing on the CPU will face downwards on the motherboard. So we're just going to put this in place. You don't need to push down. You don't need to wiggle. You just put it in place. Put down the bracket holder, and then just clamp down the retention arm. And that's it, CPU installed. So that is pretty easy. I know that frightens a lot of people when they're building a PC, but don't worry about it. You just need to give it enough force in order to get the retention mechanism down onto the CPU. And I have already installed my backplate for my CPU cooler. So I'll be using an NZXT Kraken X62 cooler. So I already have the standoffs in place for that. This board also has NVMe capability. I have an NVMe drive already installed on the board. No real need to show that to you guys. Pretty simple. And in most cases, a regular SSD will work. And I will be installing one of those as well. So we'll show you that later on in the video. So the next step will be our CPU cooler install. So what we're going to do after you already have your backplate and your standoffs in place, we're going to get a pea-sized dab of thermal paste onto our CPU right in the center. Should be good. And we can even take a scraper and just spread it onto the CPU just to get some even coverage. So now that we have our thermal paste on the CPU, what we're going to do is take our NZXT Kraken cooler, make sure the NZXT logo is facing the way that you want it. So I have it facing down. And this is the Intel LGA 115X bracket on here. So if you are using a Ryzen CPU, you will want to use the Ryzen bracket. And then all we have to install this is a few thumb screws. So 4 thumb screws. And you're going to want to get them hand tight and then tighten down with a screwdriver. So now in an X pattern, you're going to want to tighten down the bracket. So we'll start in opposite corners and just keep tightening all the way around the cooler. And you don't want to over tighten, just do it until you meet some resistance. And these will normally bottom out, so you can't really over tighten. So now that we have our cooler installed, we will take a look at installing our RAM. So for this build, I have 4 DIMMs of 8 GB Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro memory. So we'll go ahead and install this. Now all you're going to want to do for this part is just make sure that the little groove at the bottom of your RAM stick lines up with the groove in the RAM slot. So on this motherboard, we only have top locking mechanisms, so you're just going to want to push those down. If your motherboard has them on both sides, make sure they are pushed down on both sides. And then once you have it in the slot, you're just going to push down with both fingers on each side of the RAM, and you'll hear a nice click. And it's also a good idea to be doing all this install on the box that the motherboard came in. It is anti-static in terms of cardboard, so then you won't deal with any issues possibly harming your motherboard. But there we go. Now we have all 4 DIMMs installed, 32 gigs of RAM. So we'll go ahead, get our case situated. So we'll go through the NZXT H710, get everything in place where we need it in order to install our motherboard. So now here we have our H710 NZXT case. Really nice design, a full ATX case, plenty of cooling possibilities. So that's why I went with this case. You can either fit a 360mm rad in the front, up to a 360 at the top as well. So what we're going to do is install our X62, which is a 280mm AIO, at the top of our case to exhaust that hot air from the CPU, and we'll be pulling in with 360mm worth of fans that come with the case. Nice fresh air for our GPU and our CPU. So what we'll do first is just take off this top panel. So it uses a nice clipping mechanism. It is extremely hard to get off, so you're going to have to pull pretty hard. Same mechanism at the front, however we won't need to take the front off. We're not messing with any of these fans at the front of the case. To take off the glass, there is a thumb screw on the back of the case and then a tab to lift the glass off. So now we have the case nice and opened up. We already have our ATX standoffs in place in this case, which is also really nice. And the case also comes with a 140mm fan at the back. So this is the H710, not the H710i, so it is not the RGB smart device capable version of this case that NZXT makes, but this is a really nice case, and for around $140 makes for a great upgradability in the future. You can do full custom water cooling in here extremely easily. You have a pump reservoir slot on the back of the case, as well as one on your cable divider / hider. And the final thing we'll do is take off our back panel. So there's a little button on the back of the case. You push that and the panel is able to fall away. This 710 comes with 2 USB 3s as well as a Type-C port, which is extremely nice to have. The old version had 2 USB 3, 2 USB 2, but I think the Type-C is a nice welcome. We also get a fan radiator mounting bracket here that we can uninstall with some thumb screws pretty easily. So we'll use that for our Kraken X62. So now that we have our case sorted, all we're going to do is grab our motherboard by the cooler, guide it into the I/O hole at the back of the case. Make sure that we're lining up. So you're going to want to drop it in at an angle. And then we're just going to want to line up with the standoffs. And there we go. And we also have a nice slot in the case that will pop through your middle standoff on the ATX motherboard. So we should have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 motherboard screws for a full-size ATX motherboard. So it doesn't have to be super tight. You don't want to risk cracking the actual motherboard PCB. So just tighten until it's in place, but it doesn't have to be super tight. But there we go. Our motherboard is now firmly in place and we are good to go there. So we'll get this top mounted radiator bracket off of the H710 and then install our radiator and our fan. So now all you have to do is loosen up these thumb screws. They are pretty tight, however, so you're going to want to use a Phillips head screwdriver to remove this. And you see how there's a lipped edge? There's also a lipped edge up top. So then you can actually flip this around and it can get tightened in this way. So now you have way more clearance on this side of the case to then install a radiator and fans. So we'll get our fans mounted onto our radiator and then get the whole bundle mounted onto our bracket. You're also going to want to consider where you have your fan cables coming out. So you're going to want to keep them as close to the back of the case as possible. So with our radiator eventually going in like this, we'll want our cables coming off of the back side. So we will put our fans like so. And we'll use the included set of screws that came with the Kraken itself. So we have these longer screws. That way we can get through the fan into the radiator. And the majority of these parts came out of my old PC, which was in an NZXT H710. So I decided to upgrade to the 710. One for cooling and two for the possibility of some more upgrades in the future, whether that's a custom water cooling loop or something similar to that. This case gives you a lot more opportunity to do something like that. So we can get possibly, a GPU cooler, an AIO style GPU cooler when the next generation 3000 series NVIDIA graphics cards come out. And it also gives me the possibility to do a custom water cooling loop. Let's say when Ryzen 4000 or Intel 11th gen comes out. This case offers a lot more opportunity to cool a system with that caliber of components. So with an 8700K, a 280mm AIO is plenty. You can definitely get away with air cooling. And I have a RTX 2070 Super Founders Edition card, or not Founders Edition, but NVIDIA card that is air cooled as well. So now we are good to go to get our radiator installed on our bracket. We'll flip this guy around and we'll actually reinstall the bracket first. So I'll leave the radiator off the edge for a second. So I'll actually reinstall this bracket where it is, and then we'll get the radiator in place. We're just going to drop the radiator through the side over here. And there we go. So now we have the radiator up here where we want it. And now we can get our screws installed for the 240mm or the 280mm AIO. There we go. Now we have our radiator in there nice and tight. So now, if we take a look at our computer and our case. So now if we're taking a look, we have motherboard installed, radiator fan installed at the top as well. Looking at the top, we have a radiator in there. So we are looking really, really good at the moment. So now we'll start doing some cable management. We will get our PSU installed, get all the cables routed where we need them, and then of course get our SSD, our hard drive, and our graphics card installed as well. First, we can take our pump connector, sort of route it along our motherboard, and connect it to our pump AIO slot. So now we're connected to our AIO pump header on the motherboard so that we can control the Kraken pump through that, and then we'll just pass the SATA and the fan connectors through the back of the case. We have our rear fan connector, and I know it's really, really hard to see and it's kind of dark in there, but we're going to connect this into our chassis system fan header right below our AIO pump header. So all I'm going to do is plug in my 8-pin CPU connector, and then we'll route this down the case. So now you can see the back CPU extension cable, just trying to get it right and looking good. And of course we'll fix it up once we're further along in the build, but got that through. I'll get the 2 GPU, the 6-pin and the 8-pin extensions in there as well, and we'll get the 24-pin plugged in also. So now all the cables that we needed installed, we have our extension cables, we have our 24-pin extension, our 8-pin and our 6-pin GPU extensions going through that slot in the bottom of the case, and then our 8-pin CPU extension cable. We have our fans, our 2 140s from the Kraken cooler, and we'll hook those up to the CPU coolers, or the fan headers coming off of the Kraken, and we'll install our front I/O. So we'll do all of that now, we'll run all of that, and we'll get our PSU installed. So now in terms of our power supply, I have all of the cables, so it's a modular 750 watt EVGA power supply. So I have our 24-pin hooked up, our CPU, a SATA connector, and our 8-pin and our 6-pin VGA connectors. We actually have a power supply bracket in the back with some thumb screws. So we'll take that off, and then the power supply will actually slide through the back of the case. And there we go. So now we'll just run our cables through the PSU opening, back of the case, pull them through, and then slide our PSU in. And then just tighten up the thumb screws. So really nice installation mechanism for the power supply. So there we go. Power supply is now installed. I'm just going to clean up some of these cables really quick. And we can start getting everything plugged in. So now moving on to our connections. So I have our GPU 8-pin and 6-pin here, USB 3. We also have our HD audio run through that we'll have to connect. We also have our front panel connector and our USB Type-C connector. So for the front panel, you're going to want to refer to your motherboard manual as to where all those connections sit. So let's see if I can find that in here. So here you have your front panel. So we're just going to follow this guide. So we're just going to follow this motherboard manual to see exactly where we need to plug our front panel in. So just follow your motherboard manual to see exactly where those front panel connections go. So there we go, we got our front panel connector installed there. Our USB 3 is right here, so we'll get that one in as well. And we also have our system fan, so we'll see where the best spot to plug that is in. And it's probably going to be right here. We have 3 chassis fan connectors down at the bottom over there, so we'll actually run that through separately. So this will be our 3 front fans. Connect that up right here. And we have our 3 front fans hooked up. Now for our USB 3, and I do actually have a connector coming for the USB 3 to put it at a 90 to make it look a little bit nicer. But for right now, we will install it as is. And then for our USB Type-C connector, so there we go. Now we have all of our cable connections made outside of our graphics card, as well as our SSD and our hard drive. So we'll get the SSD and hard drive installed, and finally our graphics card. So now for the SSD install, all you're going to have to do is unscrew this SSD little plate. Just one screw, and then it'll clip in. Just pull on the clip, and there we go. So we'll get our SSD mounted in here. So now we have the SSD installed. And you're just going to make sure that if the clip is on this side, that your connections are at the bottom, so you can easily make the connections once it is installed. SSD is in there now, so we can hook up our SATA power. There we go, SATA power is in, and we'll use this other one for our hard drive. So now that we have the hard drive cage out, we can get the hard drive installed. Just gonna slide it in to the cage, and then just get our screws installed. That's pretty much it. So now we have the hard drive installed, we got our screws in, so we'll just slide this back into the case. Now we can hook up our SATA power for our hard drive. So I have the SATA power hooked up for our hard drive. I'll get my 2 SATA data cables and run those to the motherboard. We're also going to need to run the USB 2 cable for the Kraken, so I will do that now as well. Let's get our SATA cables on. Ooh. Got the second one installed. So we have our SSD and our hard drive hooked up now with SATA data. I'll now hook up the USB 2 connector for the Kraken. I got the USB 2 hooked up for the Kraken. And before I forget, let's actually get the connector hooked up to the Kraken as well. So now we'll just try to tidy this wiring up. And let's just make sure we can actually fit our back cover onto our H710, and we can perfectly. So no interference from any of the cables, and we're looking good. There we go. Fits perfect. And now, but not least, we'll do our graphics card. So the graphics card, of course, is the powerhouse when it comes to actually gaming on our computer. And for this build, I have an RTX 2070 Super Founders Edition or NVIDIA card. So first, we will just need to remove our two back slots. Remove the two placeholders. And they do have some nice thumb screws to actually hold in the card. We got both of those out. I can show you guys that. So now you can see we have both of these slots out of the back of the case. And now we'll get the graphics card in. So we just want to make sure that the tab on the end of the PCIe slot is down. That'll pop up once we install the card. We'll move our pump cable or pump So now that we have the graphics card installed, we're just going to put the thumb screws back onto the GPU to hold it in place. Now the graphics card is nice and in there, and we will get our power connectors hooked up. So we have our 8-pin power, as well as our 6-pin. We got both of those hooked up now. Get our cable management nice and tidy. And there we go. So we are now almost finished with the complete physical build of our PC. So we have the GPU installed, CPU cooler, everything is installed. So we'll just throw the top cover, the back cover, and the glass onto the case, and we'll get her started up. So now as we're turning on, I'm just hitting the delete key so that we can enter into the BIOS. And now we're in our BIOS. So for our CPU, the 8700K and our 3200 megahertz RAM, we have our XMP setting on for our RAM. We also have ASUS multi-core enhancement enabled. So that'll allow us to set our core frequency at 4.7 gigahertz all the time on all cores. And now we're just going to check our fans. So our Kraken fans we can control directly. So we can use that with our AIO pump. So this AIO pump setting is really controlled by the CAM software itself. So the chassis fan 1 and chassis fan 2 are what we can then control through our motherboard. So we're going to set our rear chassis fan to silent and our front chassis fans to silent as well. So we'll leave that the way it is. And now for me, this system already has Windows on it, but if you were to install Windows, and you can check out the video that I post in the card now, exactly how to download a Windows boot drive and then get Windows installed onto your computer. But what you're going to do is go to the boot menu. If you're using an ASUS board, that's here. Other motherboards will have slightly different setup, but you're going to find a boot option. So mine's currently the M.2, but you'll have a thumb drive, whatever thumb drive you're using for your Windows installer, show up there. You can select that and then automatically boot to your Windows USB thumb drive, install Windows, and then you can boot to your SSD or your hard drive or whatever solid state drive you're using. So now we can exit out of our BIOS and boot into Windows. And there we go. We are booted into Windows. So I hope you guys got to learn a lot about how to build a PC. I hope it sort of made it a little bit easier to grasp for
some of the installations and how to get everything set up. But overall, it's a really simple thing to do. You shouldn't be afraid of it. It's a really fun process once you get started. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, any comments, be sure to leave those below. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel.